From the intersection of 218 and 80, with the rivers like our own, seek for seas they never find. I'm Aaron McNally, and this is Curiosity Now. All right. Happy New Year's and welcome to Curiosity Now. This is Aaron McNally. I'm happy to have you here. And alongside me today is, of course, Bill Scher, the contributing editor and columnist for Politico. Also the host alongside Matt Lewis of the DMZ, which you can catch on Blogging Heads. Bill's also doing some short bits of commentary on YouTube and has got his own YouTube channel. You can check those out as Scherable, Scherable. Those are little bite-sized commentaries on the goings-on of the week's political happenings. Bill's also got himself a brand new podcast. The first episode is out. It's a history podcast called When America Worked, which you can catch on any of the podcast platforms. Bill, happy to have you here.
Great to talk to you.
Do you want to just jump in and talk a little bit about When America Worked before we get started?
Oh, I'm very happy to do that. You know, I'm in full-blown self-promotion mode with the history podcast. So,
sure.
You know, it's a scripted podcast, so they're very labor-intensive. And the basic premise is identifying great achievements in American history that were forged by pragmatic means. And so that's always, we talk about pragmatism, that's always a hard sell, you know, for anything. And so the challenge of it is to find the right stories and to make them interesting. And I have about a dozen stories in mind already. So the stories are out there, and it's just a question of delving into the details and creating a narrative that's compelling for folks. And the first one is about Edward Stettinius, who nobody knows, or barely anybody knows, but
we finally know now.
I hope so. He was FDR's second Secretary of State and Truman's first, and didn't last very long overall. But in his very short time, he created the United Nations, which is no small thing in my opinion. Some people might disagree. Some people give the UN a hard time, but I try to make the argument why you shouldn't.
Bob Wright is on your team on that.
Well, I gotta have a heart-to-heart with him, I guess. And Stettinius, you know, some people, when you read about, you know, the end of World War II in the UN, it's kind of, you know, like a sentence. You know, the World War II ended and the UN was created, you know, done and done, as if it was an obvious thing for the world to do after the horrors of World War II. And it wasn't that simple. There were a lot of challenges, a lot of hurdles to overcome. And Stettinius was the main guy getting over all of the diplomatic sticking points and got no credit for it, or almost no credit for it, in his own time. And Truman essentially demotes him, and which leads to his eventual resignation. He got shifted to ambassador to the UN, which was sold as a great job, and it really wasn't. For, you know, Truman was keeping him out of the loop on most things. And Stettinius quits, and he dies not too soon after that. And so he never gets his due. He doesn't even have a plaque at the UN commemorating his achievements. Doesn't get the Nobel Peace Prize goes to Cordell Hull, his predecessor, for creating the UN. So he doesn't even get the credit for that. So he's just maligned every step of the way. And so, in my opinion, it's the greatest gulf between, you know, greatest good done for the world and least amount of recognition in history, which I thought made him a very compelling subject for the podcast.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to let all the listeners know that there is a sex scandal involved. I'm not going to tell you any more on the podcast. You got to listen to his podcast, When America Worked.
I've given away too many spoilers already.
Indeed. Hey, so let's talk about, why don't we talk about, you had a famous little prediction that was like right on the money. You called it last year? You called it, you said, well, no, of course it was last year. Today is the first day of the new year. You said Pete Buttigieg is going to be that transportation secretary you called.
I said in May of 2019
It was 19. Okay, great. I'm not
That
crazy.
and the exact wording was Pete Buttigieg is on an excellent track to be transportation secretary. So to be fair, it wasn't a literal prediction. I wasn't saying I wasn't Babe Ruth pointing my finger and calling the shot. But I was actually having an exchange with Rachel Bidikofer, who's the political scientist and electoral projector. And she was making, this is pretty early in the presidential primary, and this was sort of right after Buttigieg had his breakout moment. He had the CNN town hall that went very well, and he got a big boomlet in donations, and his poll numbers starting to edge up. But by May, it was starting to fade, and I was in the mindset of, look, I think this guy's 15 minutes are over here as far as the presidential primary is concerned. Because she was making the case that he was still killing it. And I was like, I don't know about that. But I never thought he'd be the nominee. I never thought he'd be VP. He's 38-year-old mayor of a very tiny city. It didn't add up to me. But he clearly had successfully raised his profile and was considered a rising star. And where would a rising star land? And as a mayor, transportation secretary struck me as the very logical place that he would end up, where he had what remote sense of qualifications for. So that was the basis of the comment. And at any time, there were a few other times on Twitter when because I wrote a couple of not so terrible things about Pete over the course of the primary, and people would his fans would give me guff about it. And I always shoot back saying, "Look, he's on excellent track to be transportation secretary." So that was my standard rejoinder. And again, I couldn't know that's exactly what would happen, but it just made a lot of sense, and it obviously worked out that way.
Well, I'm in a college. I'm in a liberal college town in Iowa City, Iowa, and there was some definitely ardent Pete Buttigieg support here in town. But again, like you, I didn't really see how the math added up with his experience, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, there was the ardor, the passion, right? And the reason I bring him up, and he's got this now kind of like you're talking about pragmatism. We're talking about the nuts and bolts of government. He's got a place in that. He has a role in that. But let's talk about his campaign a little bit, because I think it kind of gets at something. This whole story is kind of related to your larger project as a thinker and as a pundit and as a commentator. So Buttigieg is a very charismatic man, incredibly intelligent, very well spoken. He's got some identity politics bona fides, right? He represents a minority group. He's also got this kind of interesting, from the identity politics stance, he's got this interesting thing where, he represents, LGBTQ, but he's also Catholic, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Now, so some of these are kind of soft social kind of ways of talking about people, but let's be honest, the Democratic Party in particular really responds to identity politics, or so it seems, though frequently in the last decade, you've seen that happen more with the Republican Party as well. So hopefully get your read on that a little bit later. But so I guess I don't know that I have a very well formulated question, but I want to bring up this topic of candidates who shine in the spotlight and get a lot of emotional resonance and pathos with their supporters, but don't necessarily have what it takes to serve in government as far as their credentials, their experience, et cetera. Our last Democratic president before our president-elect Biden was a guy who had been a senator for one term, came to fame at the Democratic National Convention nominating Kerry with this magnificent speech. I'm sure you remember Barack Obama's speech.
I was there.
You were there.
Yes.
So that was like a Babe Ruth moment, right? I mean, he just came out of nowhere, hit it out of the park, and people said, "Who is that guy?" And indeed, the next day at work, I was talking to a woman, an Italian Republican in Milwaukee, who said to me, "They're going to be pruning him. They're going to be watching him as a candidate." And boy, if she didn't call it, So can you talk about that balance that a candidate has to have, both that persona, but also has to have, like, because Obama arguably, and I'm hearing from some people who have read his memoir, he actually did have presidential aspirations early on and was looking at, what do I do if I can go from community organizer? I think I can get a Senate seat, that kind of thing. And what's that balance between savvy, well-spoken, sophisticated identity politics plus know-how, legal smarts, making it into a position? Of course, the whole thing got thrown into a mess because we just had a real estate guy for 4 years.
Well, I mean, but those things all are relevant to the discussion. There's a long history of shooting stars who catch lightning in a bottle and make it to the presidency or make it to some other position.
Sure.
People who have been in politics too long, who have too much of a record, too many targets of opportunity, too much baggage, they can have a hard time. It is very unusual for a guy like Joe Biden to make it to the presidency. He has an inordinate amount of federal government experience compared to many other presidents, if not all other presidents.
Indeed. And this was his third or fourth run.
Third run. I mean, and some people have gone more than once before, but usually if you're in the business for that long, you've made a lot of enemies, you have a lot of challenges, and you seem too much of a creature of the inside and not as much a person of the people. So people are always trying to find that balance. And what's tricky for Democrats is their rising stars tend to be so-called wine track candidates. They have appeal to the white college educated faction of the party, when a lot of the party is not college educated and not white. So we have lots of people over the years who have been interesting, had a lot of promise, like a Gary Hart or Paul Simon or Paul Tsongas and Howard Dean. And this year, I mean, and before Pete Buttigieg, it was Beto O'Rourke. And they were not able to translate the initial attention that they got into a broad enough base of appeal. So, Pete Buttigieg, he has a certain kind of charisma. So there's a certain kind of person that hears, oh, he can speak Norwegian. That's amazing. But there are other voters who are like, I do not care that you speak Norwegian. There's no bearing to my life whatsoever.
That's not where the big geopolitical situation is right now.
Well, look, there was a guy on the Republican side in 1940 named Wendell Willkie, who was a corporate executive, a lawyer. He was battling FDR about utilities regulation, but he was kind of a dashing figure, and even never run for office before, and had a lot of opinions that were actually fairly liberal, and more in line with FDR than a lot of the leading lights of the Republican Party. In April of 1940, he goes on a radio quiz show called Information Please, and does such and is very erudite, and is handling all these tough constitutional questions and not even getting them right, but like giving like extra historical backstory. And he impresses so many people that this whole boomlet of Willkie for president crops up, arguably somewhat encouraged by Willkie and his people themselves. And this is before there were a lot of presidential primaries. These things were decided at the convention, but he essentially takes this public momentum and barnstorms the convention and pulls off the nomination. So it's not like it's never been tried before to be a celebrity, to be considered witty and dazzling and capture the heart of the public. But this is a time when radio had a lot more broad appeal, a lot more broad access. 1940. Now you need to have more. You have a fragmented media, a lot of niche media. You got to be able to appeal to a lot of different kinds of communities, And you need, in the Democratic Party, you need that African American vote, and the African American vote is not monolithic, as has been repeated, plenty, and is correct.
Oh yeah, and Biden stepped in it with that.
Well,
that one interview.
Well, because there are generational differences, there are educational differences within every community, and it includes African Americans. There's regional differences, so on and so forth. But Biden's bedrock were older African Americans who are, again, to be. I mean, I as I always try to say, I'm not the spokesperson for the Black African American community. I'm not your source of information for the African American community. I don't take anything I say on the subject as gospel. But this is the best of my understanding. There's a big pragmatic streak among older African Americans. They've seen plenty. They've heard all the promises. If you show up in South Carolina saying, I'm going to give you free health care and free college, they're going to say, prove it, buddy. And Jim Clyburn would always say, our community has a history of being lied to, and Joe Biden has not lied to us. He had a credibility, a history that a Pete Buttigieg, not to mention a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, could not match. A Cory Booker and a Kamala Harris could not match. Nope. Booker and Harris, more than the other candidates, recognized the importance of South Carolina, were campaigning there more than the other candidates were, and they were not breaking in because Biden had a lot of base there. And Harris said, both of them essentially gave up, said, if I can't break through in South Carolina, I can't win. And the other candidate said, I can't break through in South Carolina, maybe I can win through these wider states. And that was not a good strategy either. So Buttigieg in particular had a mixed record when it came to race in South Bend. And so he's being introduced to the nation, introduced to the national African American community as someone who has a complicated record at best. That never added up to me. He knew he had a problem. He tried to solve the problem. I'm not saying it was fair that he had that problem, but just as the realities of politics are concerned, you need that relationship in advance to win over a community that has a high bar on credibility. And quite frankly, these college-educated white voters have a lower bar. They hear one Norwegian interview and they're sold. And that's not going to be enough to win in a diverse party.
No, indeed. And there was some early debate where Buttigieg was asked, so what about the race situation in your town where you were a mayor? And he straight up said on the stump, he said, we failed. We tried to do something, but we couldn't do. He didn't frame it in a situation where this is what we were up against. This is how we succeeded. This is what we couldn't. But he instead he just caved to the pressure and just said, we failed.
Well, I thought it was an honorable answer. I mean, it was better than saying something phony.
Fair enough. Yeah, absolutely. And at least he was honest. That's certainly credible.
And I think it was good for him in the long run to give a credible, if unsatisfying, answer, and to at least indicate, I know I have work to do. I know I have a lot to prove. I'm not going to pretend that I'm, the savior to all your problems from the get-go. But to win a presidential nomination in a matter of a few weeks or a few months, that's not going to do the trick. But he, unlike some other Democratic presidential candidates, he did end the primary a lot better off than when he started. And so he could be credibly nominated. Some people still complained, what experience does this guy have? How can you make this guy the head of a bureaucracy of tens of thousands of people when, he only was a mayor of a town of 125,000, with a staff of, probably a few hundred. That's ridiculous. But he's not the first person to get a promotion. He's not the first person to be given a task a little bigger than what he had before, and he's going to have a team of people, of deputies who are going to be more immersed with transportation policy than he has been over his life. And it's not that he's never been involved with it at all, because he's a mayor, and mayors do deal with roads and bridges and transit and such. He did what he had to do to improve his career, whereas, say, Julian Castro did not. Some people go into the run for presidency thinking, it's only upside. It's only going to enhance my profile. So even if I don't become president, I'll still come out better for it. And that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of people that come out of the process worse for wear. And some people don't like talking about things in a kind of this careerist way. And I think it's more interesting to talk about how parties are constructed and how you win trust and how policies can get, how change happens. Those are the more important things. But there's obviously an element of, personal ambition that gets mixed into all this stuff. And if you want to be someone who is in a position to enact change, you got to figure out how to do it, how to raise your profile and prove yourself to the public. And Buttigieg did succeed on that score.
Absolutely. It's everybody. Do you hear this? This is what you call nuance in critique. This is Bill Scher. You got to go to his YouTube channel and subscribe. Check out Shareable. Check out When America Worked, the new podcast. And check out the DMZ with Matt Lewis. You're going to get stuff like this all the time from Bill. This is nuance. This is good stuff. Critique you need to check out. So let's talk about this idea of you perked my ear because, like I said, I live in a college town. I saw there was quite a bit of graffiti, a little bit of mild property damage, and mostly just some ornery young people who wanted to, march through the town square for about 6 weeks this summer with this Black Lives Matter movement, Now, so I'm bringing this up because this is sort of that difference between full voting base and optics of public presentation of issues. Because you were talking about, how does an aging Black voting bloc differ from a young Black voting bloc? And to what extent was Black Lives Matter kind of more white college students? To be honest, there were quite a few white college students that were, and who's to know socioculturally how much of this didn't have to do with the fact that there were no music festivals due to COVID. People, young people needed a cause to have some excuse to get out of the house. You look at the intensity of the protests and you think, wow, something has to change like immediately because there's so much turmoil and uproar. But then when you actually look at how that plays out institutionally, maybe qualified immunity is getting knocked out in some cities, right? But on the whole, there's no large scale paring back of financing of police force or anything of that nature. Why don't you talk about the pragmatics of something like that, some kind of tough social issue like that?
Well, in my opinion, after the killing of George Floyd, there was a very widespread consensus that was wrong. Very little defense of the police officers, even in conservative circles, even, in the Trump White House. The video was just so stark and so cut and dry. So you had this very rough consensus. This is wrong. It became a lot more politically and socially acceptable to say Black Lives Matter, to understand that this wasn't because back in 2016 there was the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter divide, and Democrats generally be a little hesitant about saying Black Lives Matter, although Hillary initially was cautious, then came around on it.
Bernie was actually ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah, but it became easier to say after George Floyd, at least for a time. And there wasn't a consensus around let's do this 10-point plan, but there was a consensus around this is wrong, this has to stop, this has to change. And then the defund the police, abolish the police stuff, got in through social media and into some of the protesting. And that's a much more controversial stance to take. Not something that had instant widespread acceptance. And so you very quickly had a moment of rough consensus deteriorate into a controversy about, should we have police or not? And a lot of that momentum, dissipated. And so there's, I think those who wanted to fund the police can point to certain successes in certain cities. But you're talking about your bluer cities where that's the case, and even in a lot of, and it's not even across the board that these successes are happening from the defund the police standpoint. To me, there is a romanticization of bottom-up protesting, particularly in the age of social media, where it can be organized kind of rapidly.
Sure,
but what you get a lot of tail wagging the dog in that circumstance, and so whereas people who might be able to shape a more politically sound and broadly appealing strategy get too overwhelmed by what's being driven by hashtags, and you fall behind the curve. So the House Democrats pass a more pragmatic police reform bill. Almost nobody can tell you what was in it because we're talking about defund the police. And some Democrats were trying to say, I'm not for defunding the police. Some Democrats trying to say, well, defund the police doesn't mean this, it means that. And then some actors were saying, no, it doesn't. It absolutely means this. It absolutely means I want to abolish the police. So it just got very, very murky. And,
lost you a second there. You there?
I'm sorry. Did you hear that? Or was that just on my end? I'm just some audio.
Oh, you're playing. Playing a video in the background.
So some video like triggered on, like an autoplay, and blasted in my ear. So I wasn't sure what was going on. So if you have to edit that,
very very faint on my side. But so this is really interesting. So I mean, like, you have this aspect of populism that's just natural to human organization, right? Mm-hmm. You said about the romanticization of protest that exists on both sides. It's not just the Democratic Party. It's not just the left. That also exists in the Tea Party and the conservative, different movements in conservatism,
Well, I think that is a product of the Tea Party movement of 2010. I don't think. I mean, there always were people on the ideological extremes in both parties, but I think the romanticization of protesting really begins with the Tea Party in 2010 and some open talk about copying left-wing tactics. And now you see things like the liberation protest, Liberate Michigan, that kind of thing. That parallels you're seeing more readily today than I think you did 40 years ago.
I've never pushed back against a guest before, but I do agree with you that yes, in modern politics that's true, but in politics as a whole, going back, I mean, to the revolution, the French Revolution, as well as the 1960s. I mean, this is a thing that exists. To some extent, it's in our cultural psyche, don't you think?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously, you can talk about the Nazis in Germany. There's a right wing authoritarian fascism has used. Street politics over the course of history. I just think the American right coming out of the 60s looked at protesting in and of itself as abhorrent.
They were setting themselves up. William F. Buckley, of course, was a great mind at the head of that. He's like, we got to set ourselves apart from these hippies.
Right.
We have to be the ones who are wearing ties and looking together and are educated and literate and eloquent and all of these things, so that we can look and sound and think differently from the chaos of the kind of drug culture.
Yeah, and then you have the so-called Brooks Brothers riot in 2000 with the Florida election recount. Yeah. I think that whetted some appetite on the right for that those kind of tactics. And then you have the Tea Party stuff coming out of 2009, 2010, which resulted in the Republican midterm triumphs of 2010. And some folks thinking, hey, these tactics work. Let's do this stuff more. I think there are certain times in life when that kind of street heat has an impact. And there's other times when it has a very big backlash effect that is very counterproductive. So I don't think it makes sense for either side to think, all I need to do is to pour onto the streets and everything's going to come my way. Or when it doesn't come my way, rationalize and say, well, I'm playing the long game here. It'll eventually come my way. There are certain times when you are not hitting the mark in your message and your tactic, and it warrants some self-critique and thinking about, is there a better way to achieve what I want to achieve, or accept that there are limitations of what I want to achieve?
That's very interesting. I love how this conversation is just going all kinds of places I wasn't expecting. That because I'm very interested in this idea of, I once heard somebody about, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, I heard two Republicans on air. They were both never Trumpers, and they were talking about how bland the Republican platform had become. And what they said is, I've been to so many conferences where I've heard people talk about the licensing reform, as far as like how you license specialty professions like massage therapists or psychotherapists, or, all these. And they were saying that's a very boring thing. The Republican Party needed to get away from that. But in some sense, I think that that's what Trump was doing. He was like, if you have a good or service to offer to the market and you want to get in there, by golly, get in there and offer that good or service. And that's like the sort of, it's not so much that the idea was wrong-headed. It's just that it seemed abstract to a non-educated audience. And they said, let's just get a brute in there. He's a horrible person, but he's by golly, he's able to get in there and get stuff done. To what extent is Bernie Sanders playing on that same idea within the Democratic Party?
Well, Bernie's a very interesting character. He clearly has very deep ideological convictions, but it is mixed in with a pragmatic streak. And, I think that was shaped by his experience as mayor, shaped by being a backbencher in the House for so long and figuring out that, hey, if I want to not just twiddle my thumbs all the time, I got to figure out a way to get amendments into larger bills and justify my existence. And so he became very, very skilled at that. And you saw, I think, culminate, probably one of his greatest legislative successes. Whatever you feel about the merits of the push is irrelevant in terms of legislative skill. To take an issue like direct payments, a very costly proposition, not in a already achieved bipartisan compromise, or bipartisan proposal of a compromise, and force his way into the negotiations and get at least a part of what he wanted into the final bill, is an enormous achievement. And it showed a skill of identifying, here's an issue that has appeal beyond my own ideological base. Now, you might say, hey, giving checks to people, well, sure, that sure has some intrinsic appeal. It didn't require political genius to figure it out. But, not everybody pushed it. And him and Josh Hawley are the ones that pushed it. Sorry, go on.
No, please. Him and Josh Hawley pushed it.
And I think Republicans have been very good, not so much in a productive way, but to find these issues that seem very small and turn them into rallying cries.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I remember in the Obama years, and this wasn't even a true thing. They pushed this rumor that the Obama Department of Agriculture was going to ban farm equipment from being driven on roads, and they used that to foster this notion of big government out to screw little farmers. So they when you have a vision, when you have a framework, the Republican framework has always been, let's get people mad at big government. Let's find things that get them madder at big government. You hunt for those things. Sometimes you manufacture those things, and you use that to create a larger narrative. And the ideological left does that too. You see the newer socialist populist left constantly trying to take things happening in the daily news cycle and say, this is proof why you need socialism. This is proof why you need Medicare for all. Proof why you need Green New Deal. Proof why you need free college. And I think the left has a harder time with it because there isn't enough of an intrinsic base of people that make the linkage that they're making. So people can say, yeah, George Floyd should not be dead. They don't as quickly jump to defund the police as the average socialist activist does. When the BP oil spill happens, people don't immediately make the same jump as, this is why we need climate change legislation. So the average person says, this is why you need to not have oil spills. This is why you need to clean up oil spills.
Now we're getting into the meat of what I wanted to talk to you about. This is why I got Bill Scher on the program, everybody. Hey, if you want to spend $5 on Amazon, go check out Bill's book, Wait, Don't Move to Canada. Bill lays out a lot of this stuff. A lot of people were talking during the W administration about how they were done. They were just done with the United States. They just wanted to move to a liberal country like Canada. And Bill said, hey, don't do that. All right. $5, buy the book. This is the stuff he gets into. It's a dated book, but it's also an absolutely pertinent and prescient book for this very reason.
Some parts hold up better than others.
Yeah, fair enough. But what I want to say is, you talk in that book about Newt Gingrich and how Newt Gingrich played on the Reagan theme of the government's wasteful, Jimmy Carter was ineffective. Let's go in and find all the ways in which government is wasteful. Here are buckets of ice. We're getting buckets of ice delivered to senators, folks. You know how much we're spending on that? Tens of thousands of dollars a year we're spending on buckets of ice. That's how bad Washington, D.C. is, Newt Gingrich was saying, right? Mm-hmm. That's a concrete thing. Tens of thousands of dollars a year when an average working class, let's face it, Bill, white American in the Midwest is paying whatever percent of their paycheck, to go to federal income tax. What on earth do we need senators getting buckets of ice for? And that's a real concrete thing that you can play. And you're saying the Bernie group was kind of tapping into some of that stuff. Now, it didn't necessarily make the jump to, okay, we need climate change legislation. It didn't necessarily make the jump to take whatever issue. I understand ice buckets and climate change. That was a disjunctive but move on my part. But you get what I'm saying.
What's easier for Newt Gingrich, what's easier for conservatives is there is a more natural skepticism of the federal government that can be manipulated and exploited. And where Bernie and other Democratic socialists and other populists get some initial traction is saying things like the system is rigged. People are very prone to believing that the system is rigged. Where it gets harder for the ideological left is you're telling people that government is corrupted, therefore you should trust government to do all of these big things. There's a dissonance there that they have not solved.
That was exactly why I did not support Bernie. You just nailed it. I was an Elizabeth Warren guy last year, and I was a Hillary Clinton guy the election before that. And that is exactly why I didn't support Bernie. It's because Bernie said, this is a Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. This is a we're letting these Wall Street guys get rich off of, a rigged system. No, Elizabeth Warren said, we need to have policies to tax these fuckers because they're assholes, right? But, she was fighting against, let's be real, she was fighting against a lot of stereotypical attitudes towards correcting intelligent women who, are willing to call out your bullshit, and a lot of people don't like that figure. Now I'm trying to figure out to what extent Kamala Harris is that figure. Somebody like Mickey Kaus obviously thinks that, he's called her Eve Harrington multiple times, but to what extent that actually has, when Kamala Harris does the whole, I'm talking, please be quiet, I'm talking. She's speaking to a major cultural phenomenon of women feeling like they've been mansplained to for their entire fucking lives, and that's a powerful statement. Now, whether or not that translates into policy, I don't know. Bill, Thank you for your patience. I know I'm going all over the place right now.
Hey, that's what the podcast is for.
You get the gist of what I'm getting at right there.
Yes.
There's so much cultural energy that the Democrats should be able to win Senate after Senate seat. But for some reason, we can't translate this energy into hard policy. First question, why not? Second question, what should be the policy points for the Democratic Party?
Well, I think Democrats have a bigger burden because they're trying to make government work well. They don't have a nihilistic attitude about government itself. So, Republicans go at things by saying,
and let's be clear, you mentioned Hitler earlier. Hitler had a fucking Nietzschean nihilist fucking version. Trump's version of Make America Great Again is a nihilist version. It's not a Christian version. It's not a sophisticated Constantinopolitan version. It's a fucking nihilist version. And any conservative that is functioning under the erroneous rubric that what Trump was pushing was conservatism is dead wrong. I want every Curiosity Now listener to hear that. I'm loudly and clearly stating Donald Trump is not a conservative.
Yeah, I'd be hard pressed to. There are a whole lot of traditional conservatives that would agree with you on that point, and I think even Mitch McConnell, he gave a eulogy, not a eulogy, a tribute to Lamar Alexander just the other day, where he tried to make the case that Lamar Alexander was proof that conservative governance is not an oxymoron, and you may argue credibly that Mitch McConnell is hardly an example of conservative governance, being an obstructionist extraordinaire. But he's at least aware that there are people out there that want to hear that you can be a conservative and be interested in governing.
Exactly.
But so much.
Speaking of sound bites, Mitch McConnell does not understand the sound bite. The other day, he said the $2,000 stimulus bill was Democrats wanting to pay their rich friends who didn't need it. That's like the nevertheless thing with Elizabeth Warren. He just does not know how things get turned into sound bites, but that's an aside.
But even pre-Trump, going back to Reagan and the Bushes, they ran against government a lot. So if government wasn't working, they could say it's because government is inherently bad. It's not because we're bad. And so if in the case where they make government work well, they get applauded for clearing a low bar. Democrats set a high bar for themselves. We're going to make government work so well. You're going to be so impressed with all the things that we do. And there are inherent challenges in doing that because humans are imperfect and no one ever bats 1,000. And so even if you bat 500, you get hit on the where you swung and missed. Just like
can I pause? Can I interject right now?
Sure.
What you just said, that is the thing that Publius said when I think it was Victor Davis Hansen. That's who I think Publius was.
Mm-hmm.
But some guy with a Roman pen name in the Republican primary trying to get Trump into office was saying, Republicans know that human beings are flawed. That's why we're okay with Trump. We understand that Trump's flawed just like all of the rest of us. That's a basic Christian concept. Now, Democrats get bogged down. Bill Clinton got a blowjob in the Oval Office. Oh my God, that's destroyed us. He smoked pot, but he didn't inhale. That just sounds like a lie. We're just slaughtered by these accusations. Why is it the Republicans are able to go in and say human beings are flawed, but Democrats have such a difficult time saying, yes, human beings are flawed. What else is new? Barack Obama was a political genius in early books. He wrote about his drug use straight up.
Well, Bill Clinton did survive politically, and in the late 90s.
He was actually extremely popular despite the impeachment.
Well, because the economy was going well enough, whether you want to credit Clinton for that or not is a whole other question, but people did give him credit at the time. And so the point where people said, why are you haranguing about what he does in his personal life? The economy's good. Stop bothering the guy. So it was very popular to say people's flaws were not relevant so long as they were doing a good job in office. Now, when we've had this period of economic turmoil that really extends, to some degree over the last 20 years. I mean, there's been good pieces of the economy in that time, but we haven't had a real good, clear run since the 90s. Something keeps coming up, and if it's not directly economic, then a war comes up in the middle of it, keeping us on edge. So we haven't felt very comfortable as a nation in a long time, and that puts pressure on Democrats to say, here's what I'm going to do to solve these problems, these festering crises. And so right now, Biden's walking in saying we got to deal with a pandemic, the economic devastation as a result of the pandemic, not to mention climate change, not to mention systemic racism, not to mention immigration, not to mention
that was his whole DNC speech. We have 4 crises at the same time.
Right. Education crises. So very high bars being set. So
Bill, what you're telling me right now is that the Liberal Party, the Democrats, are actually, to a great extent, the conservative party.
I think they are the more responsible party. And, you go back 30 years, you might have argued that the Republicans had the responsible sheen. The stern parents were going to tell you to live within your means, and Democrats were the profligate ones trying to give goodies to everybody, fairly or unfairly. But I think that was a common perception. Whereas now I think it's much more clear that Democrats are the ones who are saying, look, we've trashed the place and we got to clean it up. The problem now
that sounds pretty conservative. We have to clean up our mess.
That's right. Now, the challenge is, how do you do it? And if you can't do it to perfection, you still get credit for it. The popular socialist side it argues you should do these very big, bold things that will lead to instantaneous benefits for people, and they will reward you for what you've delivered to them. And that all makes sense on paper. It's just getting from point A to point B is very complicated. You can pass the Affordable Care Act, and people don't appreciate the good that it's done for them until several years in. You don't get the instantaneous love for it. But it's some reason why direct payments have gotten such favor on the left is that they come quickly. Now, there are downsides to that because they're spread very thin, and the economic payoff of that probably is very short lasting.
Cheap grapes.
If you want to sustainably solve a problem, it's going to require whether one big large program or a series of small programs that work gradually over time. And if it's going to last from one administration to the next, it probably needs some bipartisan support, which invariably involves compromises, which means it's not going to be as big or as bold a program probably than what you might want. So there are these inherent tensions that constrict what can be done. And in my opinion, so I don't come in to go back to the initial question, what should they do? I'm not the kind of guy that says you should be for this specific program. This is the only program that's going to get the job done, because I don't know that to be the case. I come at it from, you should do something. You should find the votes to do something to move the ball forward, and condition folks to accept that something is not going to be magical, is not going to solve all the problems right away, but we can learn as we go. We can do something, see how it works, see what doesn't work, and then do the next thing to improve, and so we can get to where we need to be in due course. If people have more of an acceptance of that trajectory, I think Democrats could hold power for a longer period of time and get more things done. If they set high bars and excessively high expectations, then you might get severe backlashes, leading to a boom bust cycle over several years.
I'm called to remember a critic talking about the poet Wallace Stevens in Poetry Magazine, and she said, "I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the critic. I apologize," but she said about Wallace Stevenson's poetry, she said, "Serenity amidst sophistication is a triumph, like the behavior of birds." And that's the Democratic Party is this complex geographical organism of many parts, and we're behaving in these wild ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can play to any of the immediate needs of any of those initial groups, but to overplay dedication to any of them is a suicide. What we need to have is a series of chirps and bleats that communicate larger ideas to the entire group. And boy, isn't that something? Now, could I ask you, would you be willing to meditate on John F. Kennedy for a moment?
Sure.
Do you have any opinions about him?
Well, honestly, I'm fairly critical of Kennedy.
That plays into my hand. Yeah, tell me what your criticisms are. But why was he so successful despite his glaring faults?
Well, I mean, he had a lot of political problems. I mean, it's not clear to me that he would have been so successful had he lived. He was really struggling to get his programs through. And I should say, as a bit of an aside, as his personal life, I mean, this goes well beyond having affairs. Like, he was a straight up abuser. If you read, I read a piece for Politico, which was a review of every memoir written by a presidential mistress. And there are actually 3 books written by Kennedy mistresses. And they're not all damning, but the one that's most damning is Once Upon a Secret by Mimi Alford. And, you know, she was a college student intern when Kennedy was having an affair with her in the White House. And it was, you know, she says that their first encounter didn't qualify as rape, but you might read the account and argue otherwise. He forced drugs on her. I mean,
that's the weird. There is a weird gray area with Monica Lewinsky as well. She's like, it was consensual. It was consensual, but he was also an older man with great power. You know, that's that weird blurred line that you get into when you have sexual activities with someone. You know,
at least in Lewinsky, she was an adult. She was out of college. I mean, still an intern, still a power differential in the relationship.
Well, in Iowa, if you're 16, you can have consensual sex technically.
Fair enough. But I mean, Kennedy was literally calling Mimi Alford when she was at college. You know, she was there for a summer internship. She goes back to college. He would call the college, and this is what you call himself, call the college switchboard with a fake name, call her up, and then invite her to come back down to D.C. periodically for trysts. But anyway, my point is, Kennedy was a not good person in and of himself. But to get back to the politics of it, you know, he was having a very hard time trying to get Medicare passed, trying to get civil rights legislation passed. And you know, people talk about how Obama should have used his bully pulpit more. He should have gone on the road and gone to congressional districts or states of wavering senators and shook in his fist and pressured, rallied the people behind him and pressured them to go come and
at least talk to. At least talk to Fox News like at least twice a year or something.
Well, there wasn't Fox News in Kennedy's day, but Kennedy did do that. Kennedy went into other politicians, states, and districts and tried to pressure them to support his Medicare bill. And the politicians were just further alienated and offended and went the other way. And it wasn't until, Kennedy is murdered and LBJ has, it gets political momentum out of that, to be crass, and is able to push civil rights through, essentially, with the help of Kennedy's memory. That he gets his first big, political win. And Medicare gets passed. You tell the whole Medicare story is very complicated. I'm going to save that for When America Worked, for tell that full story.
Everybody subscribe to When America Worked. Get it on Stitcher, iTunes, wherever you hear podcasts. When America Worked by Bill Scher.
Well, just as a short story, LBJ didn't get Medicare passed by going to people's districts and pressuring them that way. That blunt tool in no means has a great track record of flipping Congress people. So, to me, Kennedy is a cautionary tale that should be learned from, not forgotten, and to have people then make the same argument that we should be doing things like that have been proven failures, which happened a lot in the Obama years, and perhaps some on the left are going to complain that Biden's bending over backwards to Republicans too much and not going into their districts and rallying the public by them. I mean, the problem is that the people don't necessarily get rallied. You have to rally enough people that would potentially vote for the congressperson or the senator, or be willing to withhold their votes from that person to exact the pressure. And just giving one speech in a district doesn't magically make that happen.
You're such a genius that I have 6 questions at every turn. Let me ask you this. Okay, so you say, I cannot prescribe to you, Democrats, what your platform should be. But surely, Bill Scher, you have some sense of what is the core reality of the Democratic Party. Like, what is your sense of what the left is? Can't you just at the very least guide us towards a North Star of ideological direction?
Sure. And if you go to one of the first freelance pieces I wrote, which was in the New York Times almost 10 years ago now, it's titled "How Liberals Win," and it came on the heels of Obamacare passing, and talked about how people on the left were mad that there were a lot of concessions to corporate interest in that bill. And you go back,
yeah, I mean, as a not really rich person making money in Iowa, I wasn't super excited to give money to the insurance companies. I have to be honest. But, healthcare is healthcare.
And the pharmaceuticals made out very well in the Affordable Care Act. And that's because the pharmaceuticals partnered with consumer health groups on a massive ad campaign in favor of healthcare reform.
Actually, I didn't mean to trigger a digression. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I don't know if you remember the old Harry and Louise ads, but the Harry and Louise ads were used by the insurance lobby to kill Hillary Care in the early 1990s, and the pharmaceutical lobby partnered with a group called Families USA to make ads in the Obama legislative process using the same Harry and Louise actors. See, these are the sequel to Harry and Louise, and now Harry and Louise want to pass a healthcare reform bill. I mean,
actors on screen are huge. You mentioned that before with the early Democrat contender against FDR. You mentioned he was on TV. He was on a quiz show.
Yeah.
People see a person, they associate the person with an idea, and that really affects them. That influences them, the way they think about it, an idea.
Right. I mean, in the case of these ads, I don't know if the ads were like the linchpin that like made everything fall into place, but the main point is that the pharmaceutical industry was pouring in millions of dollars to help the bill instead of unifying with a lot of other corporate interests to try to kill the bill. When you have corporate America unified against you and marshaling all of their resources, all of their money, all of their emissaries in local communities, small business people, local bankers, local hospitals, local doctors, if all that's arrayed against you, you're not going to win. But if you can divide the corporate community, then you got room to breathe. Then you have some backup for the arguments that you're making. So when I look at what policy proposals have the most likelihood of being enacted, I look at where can I divide and conquer? Where can I find a piece of the corporate community that's going to come around on this? Where can I make that compromise and find that common ground? So I actually find climate change an area that has more potential than some other areas, because there are already corporate interests, including fossil fuel companies, that are on the record saying we would do a carbon tax. We are fine with having some kind of regulatory regime that would reduce carbon emissions and transition to more clean energy, because these fossil fuel companies want to be in that business. They don't want to be put out of business, but they're happy with a transitory period where they beef up their renewable energy inventory, and they make money on that too. If you do something that's too fast, and is designed, Bernie's climate plan was designed to litigate the existing fossil fuel companies out of existence. They're going to fight that. They're going to fight that very hard. As much as you might think it's morally justified, as a political matter, if you say to the insurance lobby or the fossil fuel lobby, we don't want you to be around anymore. They're going to fight you to the bitter end. They're going to scorch the earth to stop you. If you give them a path where they can still profit, then they're not going to do that. So there are ways to create climate policy where existing companies don't die, and you can hike carbon taxes and lower other corporate taxes, so the burden is in the aggregate revenue neutral. Maybe it hits some people harder than others, but it's all manageable. There are openings for compromise. Again, I'm not saying you must do this one thing. I'm saying look for those opportunities, because those are the ways you can actually get the political cover you need to get that bipartisan support. And so not only can you get it passed, but have it sustain over one administration to the next.
Okay, Jim Smith, you're an energy guy. You do a wind farm in Iowa. You're listening to Bill Scher. Bill Scher is making his typical nuanced argument. Okay? Jim Smith, I understand. You're making a good profit. You're doing the fracking. You found some natural gas underneath the patch there. And you're worried about water supply in the area. You really don't want to sacrifice your family's livelihood. You want to observe the fact that the various chemical additions to the well water of the people who drink the well water in your area, you want to make sure that's not making them feel sick. Which, let's face it, their diets aren't good. I don't know why folks continue to try to stake out existences in rural Iowa. I don't know, Jim Smith. That doesn't make sense to me. It's not a thriving cultural mecca, that's for sure. But Al Gore got him a pretty decent broadband, so they're not completely bored. Jim Smith, maybe your immediate family's sustenance is based upon that mecca of income, but you got to think about your grandchildren's grandchildren, and those grandchildren are going to be benefiting from a more sober energy policy. So you could try to work out deals with the local farmers about, instead of using trees as their wind walls, you could instead use turbines as their wind walls to protect their crops. And those, by golly, they could generate some energy, and you wouldn't have to worry so much about drilling into the lower levels of the geological core for that.
Well, this is why culture war appeals are so troubling and challenging. Because if you can have a rational conversation with someone in rural America about these subjects, you can probably come to a lot of agreement. If the entire climate issue becomes bundled up with cultural polarization, and if you listen to right-wing talk radio, that's what they do. That the whole climate change hoax is a scheme by the secular left to rob you of your power, to increase their own power, and force their cultural values upon you. If you think that's the real ball game, you're not going to want to hear about how climate change can help benefit your small family farm. So once you cross that, and that's why even I can articulate to you what I think is a rational potential compromise on climate change, hard to achieve because it's become such a polarized subject. It's got to be depolarized to get to that place again. So that's the challenge there. That's the challenge of Democrat. It's hard to just as much. It's hard for a Bernie Sanders to show up in African American South Carolina and promise all these wonderful things. It's very hard for a Democrat to show up in white rural America out of the blue and say, "Hey, I got all these wonderful things for you." You got to build some bonds and build relationships so they think that your ideas have their best interest at heart.
Bill, you're in Amherst, aren't you?
I'm in Northampton, which is in Western Massachusetts, about 10 minutes from Amherst.
Yeah, that's where my friend Nick used to get mail. He went to an MFA program up there. He was studying at the UMass. He was a poet up there, and now I understand Amherst is the hometown of Emily
Yep.
Dickinson. Great female poet, absolutely excellent Christian poet, but also sophisticatedly, just mind blowingly wild poet as well. And he was in Northampton, where you're at. So you're up there in Northampton. That's a good place to be. It's not. There are a bunch of. I remember I had an 8th grade teacher. I can't even remember his name, but he used to have a way of saying how to spell Massachusetts. He said, that's where a Massachusetts sets. He was talking about the tobacco crop up there.
Yep.
So up there in Massachusetts, y'all seem like you're morally pure and whatnot, but let's be real. Y'all grow an awful lot of the tobacco we're chewing over here in Iowa. Let's be real about that.
The Hadley Mass, which is between Northampton and Amherst, they were known for their cigar wraps. I think I don't know how well that business is doing since the liberalization of trade with Cuba happened. And I have seen some tobacco barns being taken down, but historically, yes, that has been part of the agricultural economy around here.
Speaking of Wallace Stevens, if you want to look at the Emperor ice cream, of course, talks about the roller of big cigars. But let me not digress too far, though that is my my manner of doing. The point I'm trying to get at is there's this idiotic idea that folks out your way don't got nothing to do with folks out my way.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just bullshit, isn't it?
I think there's plenty of common ground across the country. Every state pretty much every state has some urban, suburban, and rural areas. I am not far from a whole lot of farmland here in Western Massachusetts, even though I'm in a college town and I'm in a culturally liberal town. There are Trump areas not far from me. There are issues with rural broadband access around here. So there's, Rush Limbaugh was on the other day talking about what do we have? Maybe we should talk about secession because what do we have in agreement with people in New York? New York's an enormous state. New York has tons of rural areas too.
New York is a damn Republican state in certain sectors.
And the bottom line is that we're all interconnected. We all need each other. The urban needs the rural, and the rural needs the urban, and the suburban needs both. We can't separate on who we culturally agree with more. An economy doesn't function that way. And so what I'm hopeful for in a Biden administration is, every president in recent years has tried to sell themselves as a unifier. And it hasn't always worked out that way, obviously. But Biden, I think, is even more committed to it than most over the course of his career. And I think is pretty well situated for it because he has built relationships in different parts of the country. He has bonds in Black America and white America. He understands, working class America and college educated America. He's lived in all these different worlds. So the challenge for him is to get a modicum of cooperation from the other side, because some people are going to try to polarize him and box him in and make him seem like just another Democrat. And his job is to occupy that big middle space and to say, look, I am articulating common sense that's going to work for all Americans. It's going to work for rural, suburban, urban. It's going to work for, white and non-white. And if you don't get on board with this idea, then you're the one who's marginalizing yourself. And the pressure from the public will be borne upon you. I think you saw that in this COVID relief bill, not so much from Biden, but once Manchin and Romney and others got together and Pelosi and Schumer got on board, Mitch McConnell was out there all by himself. He wasn't in a great position to say this needs to be blocked. You need to recreate that dynamic as much as possible. And if that does happen, perhaps our cultural polarization will dissipate as well.
Everybody, you heard it here first. Bill Scher up in Northampton, Massachusetts. You got to check out Shareables on YouTube. You got to be sure to subscribe, okay? Bill has his own YouTube channel. If you click that subscribe button, every time you get on YouTube, you're going to see his newest posts. And let me tell you, folks, every week, Bill is online and diligently telling us what he thinks about the goings on in American politics. And, you know, I would love to ask it, Bill, about your history. You came out of a background with public relations and you became a blogger. You started to do the Air America thing with Janine Garofalo and a lot of famous people. Some other time, maybe we can have a conversation about that. But unfortunately, today we were too driven into the issues at hand. Check him out. Check him out. He's a contributing editor to both Politico and what was the other publication?
Real Clear Politics.
Real Clear Politics. You got to check him out. Bill Scher, Scher. Bill, thank you so much for talking to Curiosity Now.
Great to talk to you as well. You're a fantastic conversationalist and interviewer, so I hope we can do it again.
Oh, absolutely. You're welcome anytime.